I'm François Bonnefon. I'm a behavioral scientist, and my mission is to understand the kind of ethics people want for machines. Because slowly but surely, we're letting machines make decisions that will have a substantial impact on people's well-being. And in some cases, when the machines make these decisions, they cannot make everyone happy. They have to treat some people better than others, and in some cases, they may have to decide to harm some people. So I'm going to give you an extreme example. It's an example about self-driving cars. Maybe you've heard this one before. So you see the self-driving car on the screen. It's in a very bad situation. It's about to hit this family of pedestrians who are crossing the street. It's going to injure them severely. But the only way to avoid that collision is to swerve into this concrete obstacle on the road. But that, in turn, would risk injuries for the passengers who happen to be a pregnant woman and a little boy. That's a terrible decision to make. So the first question is, of course, what should the car do? But the second, and perhaps most pressing question, is who gets to decide what the car will do? Who will tell the car what to do in such a situation? So here I'm giving you a few quotes from car makers and policy makers. Whose lives are the car going to save? There are a lot of ethical issues as a society that we have to work through. We will implement both the legal framework and what is deemed to be socially acceptable. And who's setting up those rules? Do we have broad consensus about what those rules are? That's going to be important. So you can see the thread here, the common theme. The common theme is that these are decisions that we need to make all together as a community. The theme here is that these decisions cannot be left to the car makers or the policymakers alone. They need to take into account what the community wants, which means that, in turn, we have to design ways to give people a voice, to give people a means to express their preferences in these matters. So my team and I started to ask people questions about what they wanted cars to do in situations like that. We ran polls and surveys. And the first thing we found was that there seemed to be a strong consensus that people were thinking, hey, if the car cannot save everyone, at least it should save the greater number. You can't save everyone, save as many people as you want, as you can. So it means that if the car is going to kill 10 pedestrians, but the only way to save them is to kill the passengers, then maybe, yes, the car should kill the passenger. If a car is going to kill 5 people on the left and 1 people on the right, then hey, maybe the car should make the decision to kill the 1 people rather than killing the 5. So it seemed to be a very strong intuition, but then we thought, wait, maybe things are a little bit more complicated. Look at this one. So the car is empty. It's a self-driving car. And now, if it goes straight, it's going to kill these 2 senior citizens who are illegally crossing the street. And the only way to save them is to swerve and go and kill this little girl who carefully waited for the pedestrian signal to be green. Now, is the correct decision, is the preferable decision to kill this little girl, because this way you kill only 1 and not 2? I'm not going to ask you to have a show of hands. Now, I know it's a terrible decision, but I'm pretty sure that some of you are feeling uncomfortable with the idea that in that case we should save the greater number by swerving and killing this little girl. Of course, I piled on many features in that scenario. It's a little girl. She's crossing the street legally. She's not in front of the car at this moment. So when we complicate the situations, we may get into examples where it's not clear any longer that saving the greater number is the preferred option for people. But Of course, we must not stop there. Why stop there? We can include more characters. Pregnant women, babies in strollers, dogs. But when you try including more and more characters, you get into a level of complexity that is quite daunting. You very quickly get into 1 million possible scenarios. So how do you run a survey when you have 1 million questions? There's simply no way to do this. So the first thing you try is to reduce the complexity. You try to design a clever exploration strategy in the scenario space so that you can reduce maybe the complexity by 2 orders of magnitude. OK, so now you're down to maybe 10,000 kinds of questions. But the problem is still there. How do you run a survey if you have 10,000 questions? There's no standard way to do this. So our strategy was to design a website. It's called the Moral Machine. And what the Moral Machine does is that when you visit the website, it throws scenarios at you from a huge space of possible variants. And you just say every time what you think the car should do. Click on the left, click on the right. So our hope was that enough people would visit and use this website that we would be able to explore this huge space of scenarios. And of course, when you start a project and you think, OK, let's make a website, let's make it viral, and maybe we'll be able to analyze the data, well, that's easier said than done. So it took a lot of work, and it took, quite sincerely, a lot of luck. But the Moral Machine went viral. Nowadays, I think we've hit 100 million responses on the website. And a few months ago, 1 year ago, we decided to publish the analysis of the first 40 million responses in this paper in Nature. So this shows you where people come from for this initial data set of 40 million responses. So there's a lot of white space on that map, but essentially, you could superpose a map of internet connections in the world, and you would get this. So basically, everywhere on the planet where there is an internet connection, some people connected to the Moral Machine and expressed their preferences. Now, what did we get? So we analyzed the data set by identifying 9 parameters that people seem to use when making their decisions. So I want you to focus on the bottom of that graph, where you can find the 3 big factors, the top 3, the big 3 factors that people use when making these kind of decisions. First, they want to save humans rather than non-human animals. OK. Then they do have a strong preference for saving as many people as possible, but they also want to protect the kids. That is that if they have a choice between saving the greater number and saving the kids, then they hesitate a lot. It's a difficult trade-off. So save the humans, save the many, save the kids. And then there are other parameters that would be well worth a discussion, but I don't have time to get into that. Okay? So we can compute these preferences for every country in the world. So for each country in the world, we can define a profile of preferences. It's basically a vector with 9 numbers, 1 number for each preference. So for example, we can do this profiling at the level of the European Union. Now, don't squint too much, because when we do that at the level of the European Union, basically we get the same thing in every country. There is a very, very strong homogeneity across Europe in the way people make these decisions. There is one exception on that graph, by the way. I'm not sure I'll actually get to tell you which country in Europe is the outlier. There's one country in Europe that is very, very special and different from the rest of the Union. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, it's France. And I still don't understand why. but I'm making it my personal mission to understand why Frenchmen and Frenchwomen behave so differently. All right, so when we do that across Europe, we don't get a lot of interesting variation. It seems that the Europeans pretty much agree on this. But of course, we can do that at the level of the world, the planet. So what we do is that we use clustering algorithms to try to identify countries that look the same in terms of their moral profile and different from countries in other clusters. Importantly, when we do this, we only give the algorithm the 9 scores of moral preferences. We do not tell the algorithm where spatially the countries are located in the world. But when we looked at the result of this clustering analysis, it was very striking that countries were grouped geographically, with some interesting exceptions. So we could design this moral family tree of the world. Now, we could spend probably half an hour or 1 hour discussing that graph, but if you want the gist, what you find is that there are 3 big blocks of countries. The global West, with all the Western countries and the former British colonies like New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa. So that's the global West, with a profile of preferences. Then you have another block, which is Eastern countries and Muslim countries, grouped together. And then a third block, which is the Southern Hemisphere, with almost all the countries in Latin America and South America. Plus, these strange subclusters that, together with the Southern Hemisphere, you get France. France, and interestingly, all these formers are its former colonies. But anyway, so I cannot actually tell you what exactly are the differences between these countries. It would take me a lot more time than what I have left. But I want to emphasize one thing. We do find these 3 blocks which respond differently, but they always have the same directional preferences, which means that, for example, countries in these 3 blocks have a different strength in their preference for saving women rather than men, but every single country in the world prefers to save women rather than men, except, I think, like Oman, or a couple of countries like this. But the preference for saving women is huge in the southern cluster, smaller in the western clusters, but it's always there. All right, so we have all this data, and I want to circle back to the initial question, which is, what do we do now? We do have this data about people's preferences for how self-driving cars should behave in situation of unavoidable crashes. But now that we know, what do we do? And I want to make something very, very, very clear. Our intention has never been, and we've stated that repeatedly, our intention has never been to make this a global democratic exercise where people would vote on the moral machine to tell their governments what to do. It would actually be a pretty terrible idea, because if you look closely at the moral machine data, you would find, for example, that people have a strong preference to kill the homeless. That's not something that, that's not something that we can even conceive of doing. So it's not a voting exercise. Our goal was not to tie the regulator's hand. But 2 things will happen. Governments need to know what people are not willing to accept, because if governments want to do something that people don't want, then they have a lot of explaining to do, and this is where the data will matter here. And in some cases, well, the specialists, the experts, the philosophers do not agree on what to do. For example, there is still no agreement on whether cars should legitimately kill someone to save many people. Well, in those cases, when the expert thinks that both options are conceivable but cannot agree on what to do, then maybe we can use this data as a tiebreaker. Thank you.